You ready?
Ready for anything. I was born in Linz, Austria. Linz, of course, was the hometown of Hitler and of Eichmann. So there's a whole story connected with that. My background, we were pretty well off and so on, but we were a Jewish family in Austria. My mother was actually born in Switzerland. My father was Austrian, and he died when I was 6 years old. That's one of the important anchor points in my history. I lost my father so early. And the other important one is at the age of 13, I was sent to boarding school in France. The history behind that is I had an Alsatian uncle who thought that Austria was not going to survive. And he advised my family to get me out of there. But my family didn't exactly accept the prediction for Austria, but they thought it would be good that I learned French, etc. So I had my first few years in school in the gymnasium in Linz. There was a lot of anti-Semitism long before the Anschluss in Austria. And I was the only Jew in my class, but a very assimilated family. I was not terribly aware of that. But at the same time, that was it was a good thing that I got out of there. Well, one of the things which I remember is that my best school friend at one point told me, he said from one day to the other that his father told him he can't play with me anymore, he can't come to our house anymore because he was Aryan and I was not. And many years later I went back to Austria and he was still alive. He didn't remember that, and he thought his father wasn't particularly a Nazi, but he certainly was quite anti-Semitic. So I was sent to boarding school in France. The Alsatian uncle actually decided where I was going to go because it was near the Peugeot factory, and there was a guy who sold the first foam rubber seats to the Peugeot factory. The French boarding school were a Napoleonic model and very tight, very controlled, and I hated it. And but it was quite an experience. I didn't know any French, but after 2 years, I told my mother that if she sends me back, I'm going to throw myself under the train. So instead, we moved to Nancy and lived in a smallish little house, but I was in the French lycée, and I loved it. I had some wonderful teachers. The French lycée, if you were good in the humanities, you could get away with not focusing very much on science and math. So that's one of the things which later on I had to catch up. And this is where Central YMCA College played a part later on. So anyway, I was in a boarding school. But then came 1938, and 38 was the Anschluss. This is when Austria welcomed the Nazis, you know. There's a talk about the invasion, but that's a misnomer. It was much of Austria welcomed the Nazis. But I had gone back to Austria every summer till then. I had a half-sister married in Linz, and they were trapped, but eventually, again through complicated maneuvers, was able to get out of Austria and actually came to Nazi, also survived. But then they had a whole complicated story. When my mother and I could get to America, they were trapped. If you've seen the film Casablanca, the story of my sister is pretty much that and her family is that story. But eventually they also managed to get to America. How I loved school in France and some very important professors. And in terms of topics, the French explication de texte, the story, the reading literature and studying the motivations of the writers in some ways. I see kind of a continuity from this education to what I eventually became, a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. The same Alsatian uncle who was he was a very tough guy, but he was very realistic. And he anticipated that France would not win the war. I remember he was interviewing his son-in-law, who was a lawyer, but he was drafted in the French army. And I remember him interviewing him and checking on what equipment they had and so on. And he thought France would lose the war. So actually 1 year before the war started, he rented some apartment space for the family in southwestern France, because he lived in Strasbourg and we were in Nancy, and it was too close to the border, so he was a very practical, wise guy. But I was an Austrian citizen, and there was no more Austria, so I was considered an enemy alien. And the French authorities told me, get out of this area, which is too close to the border. Perhaps they won't bother you if you're further south. My brother-in-law by that time was in Nancy also, and he had never driven a car, but within a few days learned to drive a car and we loaded our mattress on top of the car, and we were part of this exodus from the north to the south of France, I remembered. And I remember it was a very slow trip because there were many horse-drawn carriages on the road, and the horses lost the hoofs and stuff, so that the tires got blown up all the time. Eventually went to actually Vichy. My uncle and his wife, and at that time my mother was visiting him, were in a hotel in Vichy. That was before, quote, Vichy France, you know, this was just part of France. But we were told that the people, the refugees, were being interned, and so we didn't sign in to the hotel in Vichy, and the next day continued to a place called Brive-la-Gaillarde. This is where my uncle had rented his apartments. And so we went south, and it was quite a contrast because in the north it was already blackout. You know, this was during the so-called phony war. But in the south, I know there was a kermesse, a fair, and lots of joyous life still. So it was quite a contrast there, but settled in. But then, of course, there was the question what was going to happen to us. I still had to register an alien, but I don't know how we learned about that, but there was a school, a French Catholic school, École Bossuet, and they needed a German teacher. So I talked to the priest who was head of the school, and they hired me to teach the German class in this private lycée, college it was called. And I was only about a year and a half or 2 years older than my students. And then there's a funny story, because he said, don't tell the class that you're Jewish. I said, okay. What about the prayers? I said, well, I'll tell the class that you're used to saying your prayers in German, so you ask one of the, how about the sign of the cross? He says, we went to make the Star of David. Nobody will notice the difference. So he was a wonderful guy who later on found out actually died of a heart attack the same day that the Germans occupied all of France. So I got the special permission because one of my students was the son of an ex-minister or something, so I was permission not to be interned, but I had to register every week with the police. Oh, by the way, I had just passed my baccalaureate de philosophy. I was a good student in French, very proud of the fact I was the only foreign-born student who was represented the city of Nancy in the national competition. Didn't win, but at least this uncle had factories, and he wanted me to study pharmacy in order to, he had no sons, to take over some of his pharmaceutical factory. But that was not at all what I wanted to do. I had some professors who had interested me in literature and explication de text, and so my plan was to become a teacher, but maybe a high school teacher, hopefully a university. But if you were a naturalized French citizen, you were not permitted to teach in metropolitan France for the first 5 years. So believe it or not, my plan was to study comparative literature, but teach in French Indochina, Vietnam. And you know what happened to that prospect. So, so what I was told in the long run, I couldn't be protected from being interned as an enemy alien. So since my mother was born in Switzerland, and the Swiss quarter was pretty empty, you know, in order to get to America, you had to have you had to get a visa, and the visas were restricted for different countries, and of course, since there were so many Germans and Austrians and others who wanted to get out, there was no chance to get a visa. And but because I was minor, and my mother was born in Switzerland, she and I got out on a Swiss quota in late February 1940. And I was told it was the second to the last boat out of France, but in any case it was on a convoy. It's interesting, if you think of a convoy against the German U-boats, but if you thought of a convoy, you see a lot of ships, but you don't. A convoy, they're so far apart, you practically don't see them. And so it was a long trip. On the way back, we went to Blackout, Paris, and then left from Le Havre. And you can imagine the contrast between Blackout, small town, and, well, Brive-la-Gaillarde wasn't blacked out, but Paris on the way was. But the contrast between this and arriving in Chicago. And why Chicago? Because my Alsatian uncle had a very distant relative in Chicago who gave us the affidavit. What is an affidavit? An American citizen had to certify that an immigrant would not be a burden to the authorities financially. So they gave us, this distant relative, I guess I can mention the name, Nachman, N-A-C-H-M-A-N. And they had a big factory in Nachman Springfield Corporation, which I think was a big mattress factory in Chicago. And so my mother and I, after 2 days in Chicago, unbelievable experience seeing the life of, arriving in New York, seeing the life of New York after this blackout in France, and arrived in Chicago, and the Nachmans picked us up on the railroad station, chauffeur-driven car, and brought us to an apartment they had rented in Hyde Park area, which, however, apartment was right next to the IC railroad, so it was a very noisy apartment. The son, Nachman Jr., the first night wanted to introduce me to Chicago nightlife and took me to various night spots, and I remember playing dice. Played dice, so I had one night of acquaintance with Chicago nightlife, and then beginning of the week, once he picked me up in his car and drove me from Hyde Park to the factory and introduced me to a German-speaking foreman in the maintenance crew, and I got assigned to the maintenance crew, gave me a uniform. My salary was minimum wage, 30 cents an hour, but it didn't last long. My first job actually was painting the walls in the toilets. Independently, I wasn't very good or very fast, or anyway, I was fired before too long. But the lawyer of the Nachmans took me on, and then became quite a story of different jobs in Chicago. But he also arranged for me to go to school, and at first it wasn't Central YMCA. I had some business class and learned some business English. I had one course in a junior college, but then it was Central YMCA night school. But I should tell you about some of the jobs I had. The jobs I got, there was a Jewish agency. I got a job as a maintenance man in a campus, Lake of the Woods girls' camp. And again, I wasn't very good. I remember I fixed a boat and it sank the same day. But it was a shallow lake, so not a problem. But at the same time, this is when, in the months during which France fell, and we were terribly worried about my sister and her story. And so anxious times. I think it was Senator Dirksen who managed to help my brother-in-law, who was born in the Greater Austria, so couldn't get a visa either, but clergymen were excluded from the visa. I think the story about the refugee stories might be of interest now, with in connection with the current refugee stories. He had a good Jewish education, but the local rabbi and then the Grand Rabbi de France, the French rabbi, signed that he had enough of Jewish education that he could function as a rabbi, which was really pushing the limits, but it permitted him to get a visa to get out of. They had the visa to travel through Spain and Portugal. After some, it was hard to get those transit visas to the States. But all of France was occupied the same day that they arrived on the French-Spanish border, and the French wouldn't let them back in, and the Spaniards wouldn't let them in. They bribed somebody and got back into France and managed to get to Marseille in a small boat to North Africa, where they were interned. And this is where the Casablanca story took place for my sister and her family. She was pregnant. She had one daughter who was about 3 years old, and the other pregnant with another one who was born, I think, a few weeks after they managed to get to the States in the small boat. So where am I with my story? The jobs in Chicago. If you respond to ads, young men wanted no previous training necessary. We'll train you, etc., and whatnot. I remember one of those jobs, a downtown building in Chicago, and very mysterious. A loophole. Someone looked at me at several doors before I was let in, but they were going to train me as a Jujutsu instructor, which I wasn't particularly interested in. But Jiu-Jitsu had an echo for me because in Austria, going back, the anti-Semitism around me, I joined at that time Jewish Boy Scout, Jewish Scouts of some kind, blau-weiß, blue-white, but then there was another one, the revisionists came in, Zionist but revisionist, and they were the ones who became eventually the foundation of the Israeli army, and they taught us to some self-defense, so actually taught us when I was 11 and 12 a little bit of jiu-jitsu. So, but those jobs in Chicago, one of the jobs was I got with the Illinois Railroad. They all lasted very shortly, but not necessarily because fired, because I was learning English and had better offers. One job I had with the Illinois Central, they were changing from the railroad retirement system to the equivalent of Social Security. So they had to be transcribed, and I know I was involved in supervising a whole bunch of girls who by hand transcribed retirement data from one set of files to another. What else? I had a job in a lampshade factory that taught me a lot. Remember, all this is between 1940 and 1944. And it was piecework. The people who packed the lampshades were paid by piecework, so to work very fast. But the ones who set up the boxes for those who packed it were also in piecework, but they were driven by those who were paid by how many they could pack. Each time we got faster, they lowered the rate of pay. Eventually, I think there was an attempt to unionize the factory, but I learned something about the importance of unions. And then shortly before I got into the American Army, the other thing is with the income of 30 cents an hour, we had to do something else, and my mother took jobs. My mother was spoke 4 languages. She did some language teaching, but also cooking for families at night. And I remember sometimes I came to wash the dishes after she was. At that time, for orange juice in the drugstores, they still squeezed oranges. So there were lots of orange peels. And I collected orange peels. And my mother candied them, and I tried to sell them house to house. And I remember the bag of moist orange peels broke, and I was standing in the middle of the train, surrounded by wet orange peels. And then and then I got a job in a chemical supply place. Maybe I shouldn't mention its name because it's not very savory in some ways. It was, at the time, it was price controlled. My formal job was purchasing agent, but my actual job was I was told I had to figure out how to get around the price control. And I remember very specifically Caron Tetrachloride, industrial grade, and there was a price limit on how much you could charge per gallon. And when I told that to the boss, I said, "Oh, did you say 1 gallon? Oh, from now on we'll only sell it in 3/4 gallons. There's no price control." So I was exposed to some business practices. By that time I had some friends, a few refugee friends, and some American friends. One of them was a close friend of Saul Bellow. And I remember going to the celebration of when Saul Bellow had his first book accepted. Okay, the other job I had eventually, in Waukegan in a paint factory, and they had to figure out the cheapest way to ship. This was a bit of an intellectual challenge to figure out how to ship material. So shipping Central YMCA College. This is where I took all my different night courses during all this time. The director of the school was Sparling. And I met Sparling, and Sparling was interested in my story, and he sent me to a banker in Chicago, Midtown, who gave me a partial scholarship. Was it $75 or $25? I'm not sure, but it was a partial scholarship with which I took the courses at Central YMCA College. So I do remember some students. I think there was one other refugee guy whose name I don't remember, but I remember he became a prominent medical researcher afterwards. And I remember some very good courses, and I got very interested in psychology, clinical psychology. You know, at that time, the clinical psychologist was a specialist in testing. It was not usually, they were not usually therapists. And besides, what could I expect? So I think sort of a realistic compromise between what I was interested in and could expect to make a living at was personnel work of some kind. So I remember courses, besides the psychology, variety of courses, also counseling. There's a whole testing world of job interests, professional counseling. So this was probably the realistic goal that I had in mind at the time. And just before I got into the Army, I got an internship, externship, anyway, at Chicago State Hospital. So I had a few months of actual daytime work in the state hospital. And there I became acquainted with a kind of somebody by the name of Kendler, who was a very gifted psychologist and very bright, and realized that the people who had the MD, even if they were not particularly brilliant, were the bosses of the psychologists. So that was sort of a seed idea that played a role in my decision later on. But I had this experience in the state hospital with some interesting anecdote of my first encounter with some psychopathic patients and so on, which I won't go into. And then the American Army was drafted. I was together with people who, the selection, couldn't understand why those people who had worked in the postal workers and the people who did the administrative work in the postal work and personnel work. I remember being interviewed, what kind of assignment I was going to get in the Army. And the interviewer asked me if I knew something about Ludwig Bemelman. Ludwig Bemelman, he was an author, and he himself had been drafted, I guess, in World War I, and he wrote a book called My War with the United States. And it was a book which I later got, but it was very funny experiences as somebody with a heavy German accent as being in the American Army. So he asked, I remember he asked me, do you know the Bimmelmann story? I said, no. So he told me the story about being on guard duty in an American Army camp, and two officers who had the night out and were a little drunk when they came back and says, halt, and halt, who goes there? So the Bimmelmann says, halt, who goes there? And the officer says, my God, I've gotten the Germans that far. So he told me this, and he was quite amused by my being a new Bimmelmann in the American Army. The American Army basic training, by that time, apparently they had enough German and French speakers, so the personnel work is what took over, and they sent me to Institute for the Crippled and Disabled in New York to take some courses. Became a so-called rehabilitation counselor. Actually, this was the first rehabilitation training in the United States that was going on at the time. But my job was not terribly interesting. Most of the time I spent William Beaumont General Hospital, filling out the forms of people being discharged. And they were psychiatric patients and plastic surgery patients, trying to prepare them for civilian life. One interesting phenomenon was the German rocket scientists had been brought to the United States, and apparently there was one German rocket technician who behaved in a strange way, and they asked me to evaluate him. And since this was an interruption of my monotonous, of my not so interesting duties, I gave him a Rorschach test. I had become an assistant teacher in a Rorschach course. It took him forever to give responses, which were quite normal, till he eventually said he was going to go to on a rocket and bring back a rock with which he could cure cancer. So it took a long time till the psychotic material emerged. So that was the end, and then discharged for the Army. GI Bill, not night school for once, so I had to catch up on science courses. I took 1 year in chemistry at Cornell, and then I got into the first Veterans Administration clinical psychology training program. This was a profession that was actually being modified because they needed people with all the returning veterans. I still took 1 or 2 courses. Most of the work as a teaching assistant, taking courses, trying to catch up on my missing science courses, and worked in the VA clinic as a psychologist. How I had the energy for doing all of that but anyway, so I got most of the work done toward a PhD in psychology, since in order to become a psychoanalyst, they had to be a physician and psychiatrist at that time. And so medical school, the first one I got into was Emory University. It was very hard to get into medical school because so many returning veterans, tremendous number of applicants. A teacher at the University College by the name of Neff, with whom I did my master's thesis on time perception. Time perception had been, again, a very early focus, because in my French lycée, I had one teacher who was a direct student of Bergson, French philosopher who wrote a lot about time, so it was an ongoing interest unto these days. But anyway, medical school, which was not so easy for me, internship, Michael Reese in Chicago, and I met my wife, Marion, at the University of Chicago. I was already in medical school, but I lacked one course to a PhD, so I took a summer course. Actually, it was a course on one of those funny anecdotes on animal instinctual behavior, and this is where I met Marion. I had a grant from medical school to study. We had to have a small research project on our own, and mine when I wanted to study electroencephalography and hypnosis. And I asked her to be a subject, which she refused, so I had to go out with her instead. And then I got accepted to the return to my psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, I got a reasonable rate and some credit. So internship at Michael Reese Hospital, and Marion was doing some research actually in the lab at the labs at Michael Reese. She got her PhD 1 year before I got my MD, but this is going back again. So psychiatric residency at Yale, and I got a job at Chestnut Lodge. Chestnut Lodge was a psychoanalytically oriented hospital in Rockville here, of quite prominent reputation. I Never Promised You a Rose Garden was a book written by a Chestnut Lodge patient who became a prominent novelist. And Frieda from Reichmann was a German refugee psychiatrist who was working there and who was very prominent. And she still interviewed me for the job, but she died just before I actually started working there. After that professional career, I worked 10 years at Chestnut Lodge, at the same time some private practice, psychoanalytic training. I started teaching at George Washington Medical School, where I'm now an emeritus professor, and became a training analyst. I don't know if you know, psychoanalytic training involves, you have to be analyzed yourself and be supervised in cases. And so I became, up through the ranks, a training analyst. And I got involved in institutional work, became eventually a vice president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, and I did a lot of helped reorganize psychoanalysis in Eastern Europe and also in Central Europe, also in Germany. At the time when Hitler came to power and all the Jews were thrown out of the German Psychoanalytic Association, there was I think a nephew of Goering who took over, and it became what was called the Goering Institute. And after the war, it was not accepted in the International Psychoanalytic, but not so much because for political reasons. I mean, he even kept some of Freud's books in the back room, but the training just didn't become, was much more relaxation, therapy and other forms. So what they wanted to become, the new group wanted to become acceptable to the, and catch up with developments in psychoanalysis. So I got quite involved with the rebirth of German psychoanalysis, and then Eastern European psychoanalysis, involved with Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary first, so I was quite involved with this. And all this time did some teaching and lecturing and writing. I was always interested in drawing and painting, so I never stopped doing that. And I never submitted anything to an amateur show. I was very proud of that. So that's about my story. And then we had, along the way, 3 sons. And that's another whole story. Amen.